Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to the webinar, Is Nearshoring Dead? Mexico in an Age of Tariffs and Reindustrialization. My name is Ryan Berg, and I direct the Americas program here at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Thank you for joining us for what promises to be a timely and thought-provoking conversation on the future of nearshoring in Mexico and economic and supply chain security efforts in an age of U.S. tariffs and a push for reindustrialization. Before we begin this event, a little bit about the logistics of the next 60 minutes. The event will begin with opening remarks by our panelists, followed by a moderated discussion. Please note that this live stream discussion will be made available immediately after the event is over on the event webpage. If you have a question during the event, please submit it on the event webpage by clicking on the Ask a Live Question button. Decades of trade liberalization, trade deals like NAFTA and now the USMCA, and a shared border have helped the United States and Mexico forge one of the most dynamic bilateral trading relationships in the world. This partnership has not only enhanced competitiveness across sectors, from automotives and electronics to agriculture, but it has also positioned North America as one of the most formidable blocs in the global economy. In recent years, as competition with China has increased, supply chains snarled during the COVID-19 pandemic, and the reality of a turbulent world hit home for many Americans. Policymakers in multiple administrations saw North America as a font of stability and security. In the first Trump administration, the concept of nearshoring or friendshoring took hold. That is, the deliberate policy of extricating supply chains from East Asia, and especially from China, and moving them to friendlier nations, often geographically proximate to the United States, that share values and are less likely to use supply chain chokeholds as leverage. This policy continued under the Biden administration, and Mexico benefited handsomely from increased foreign direct investment, the boom in industrial parks, especially close to the U.S. border, and companies exploring the movement of their operations from East Asia to Latin America, or at least an expansion of their operations to Latin America, in an effort to build supply chain security through redundancies, what some scholars called a 1+1 strategy. However, in the second Trump administration, the administration has moved away from this erstwhile bipartisan consensus. President Trump often highlights the weaknesses of the U.S. domestic manufacturing base and campaigned on the reindustrialization of the United States. In order to incentivize companies to move back, the administration has leveraged tariffs, including on North American partners. Multiple rounds of tariffs on Mexican exports to the United States, including on non-USMCA compliant goods of 25%, steel and aluminum of now 50%, automotives of 25% minus US content, and some other tariffs, including on tomatoes, has continued the uncertainty, potentially chilling long-term investment planning for private firms. For businesses seeking to de-risk and realign global supply chains in the wake of the pandemic and the rising geopolitical tensions, this kind of instability makes strategic planning very difficult. This challenge is particularly acute for Mexico, positioned at the nexus of North American production and initially benefiting from the global reordering of supply chains. Mexico is a natural beneficiary of nearshoring. And yet, a new push favoring U.S. production over USMCA-based supply chains has forced Mexico to reassess its competitive positioning. Mexico, too, has published a plan to increase domestic production, so-called Plan Mexico, which is a detailed document including production goals in a number of areas intended to not only boost domestic production, but also excise the role of China from North American supply chains. In this complex panorama, what is Mexico's role in contributing to economic security? If nearshoring is no longer a strategy being pursued by the U.S. administration, how should policymakers be thinking about North America, and specifically about economic policy with Mexico? And from Mexico's perspective, how should the country be thinking about engaging the United States on issues like economic security in this new and complex panorama? These are difficult questions indeed, and to discuss them, I'm joined by three expert panelists this afternoon. Our first speaker is Vanessa Rubio Marquez. She's professor in practice and associate dean for extended education at the LSE School of Public Policy. Professor Rubio Marquez has a 25-year-long career in Mexico's public sector, including serving as senator and deputy minister of finance, social development, and foreign affairs. She has represented Mexico in various international fora, including the United Nations, the IMF, the World Bank, the OECD, and the G20, just to name a few. She was involved in bilateral and multilateral negotiations, including the USMCA and the Pacific Alliance. Our second speaker this afternoon will be Eric Farnsworth. He's a brand new senior associate with the Americas program at CSIS. Eric, as many of you know, was previously the longtime vice president of the Washington office for ASCOA. That's the Americas Society Council of the Americas. Prior to the ASCOA position, Eric served in government with the U.S. Department of State, Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, and in the White House. He is an expert on trade and investment, U.S. relations with Latin America, and democratic governance and the challenge of authoritarian regimes in the region. And third, we'll hear from Diego Marroquin Bitar, who's adjunct fellow with the Americas program at CSIS. Diego was previously the inaugural Burson Foster North America Fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center. He also worked at the Brookings Institution as a senior analyst. Diego co-founded the North America Project at the U.S.-Mexico Foundation, the nonprofit North America 3.0, and he curates the North America Compass Substack. I've asked each one of our speakers to give 5 minutes of opening remarks. We'll start with Vanessa, and then we'll go to Eric, and then we'll hear from Diego, and then we'll launch into a moderated portion of the discussion. Vanessa, over to you for your remarks.
Thank you, Ryan, and thank you to CSIS for putting this panel together. It's a pleasure to be here with Eric and Diego as well. So, yes, I don't think that nearshoring is out of the picture. I just think we should perhaps think more of sort of reshoring. We have heard the nearshoring, the friendshoring, the ally-shoring. Sometimes we might not feel near, we might not feel allies, we might not feel friends, but we still think about the reshoring sort of trend in the world, and definitely one that the U.S. is promoting, as you mentioned, in relation to the industrial policies and others. Of course, the tariffs policies. I would say that we are definitely in what John Galbraith called back in the 1970s the era of uncertainty, or the age of uncertainty. And of course, he was then referring to the economic system that he thought was unstable, sounds familiar, that he thought was inefficient, sounds familiar, and then it was also socially inequitable, again, sounding familiar to all of us today. I also think that this uncertainty, in the case of Mexico and in relation to the United States, has two main sources, and this is what I want to focus my remarks on. The uncertainty for Mexico derives from a series of domestic policies in the one hand, and in the other hand, from a series of international shocks, mainly those stemming from the U.S. Policies, but of course in the wider context of geopolitical and geoeconomic challenges. So speaking about the domestic challenges, and here is where there's things, and as you mentioned, I was a policymaker for 25 years. There's things you can control being a policymaker, and there's things you cannot control. What you can control is your own policy, and doing the right policies, and doing productive and sustainable policies for growth and prosperity. So that's what you can control. And there's a series of question marks that we can put in relation to the current Mexican government, which is the enormous concentration of power, of political power mainly, but also economic power. So the fact that Mexico is having a constant elimination of checks in this power, in the form of perhaps not having a civil service the way we used to have before, and that not creating the adequate checks within the executive, then of course now a huge majority in both chambers of the legislative, the Senate and the deputies, out of a friendly interpretation of a specific law. I won't get into the details, but there's that. So it's the executive without checks, the legislative without checks, and now most recently the judiciary without checks, with the new very overarching reform in which half of the representatives of the judiciary have been already elected in a direct form for the first time. And then on top of this, we got rid of the technical and autonomous and independent bodies. The only one still standing is basically Bank of Mexico, the central bank. So all of these means that there is, as I was saying at the beginning, a series of policy challenges creating uncertainty stemming from the domestic stance and stemming from a series of domestic actions. So there is the first thing that I think we should understand, which is when we ask ourselves, why is Mexico not growing? Because Mexico didn't grow during the 6-year term of Andrés Manuel López Obrador. Basically, we grew close to 1%. Now we're going to be growing close to zero this year. That's the consensus of the market and international financial organizations. We're, of course, trying to balance public finances after the spree we had in 2024, where the deficit was taken to a 36-year historic high, in a context of presidential elections. And now we're also trying to address effectively Pemex's inviability and the huge debt, Pemex being the largest fallen angel with a financial debt of $101 billion, plus the debt plus the non-financial debt accounting for perhaps up to 80% of this. And of course, all of this creates, as I was saying, a series of domestic policy driven uncertainties. On the other hand, as you were saying, Ryan, there have been a series of attempts to anchor growth and to anchor business investment in Mexico in relation to having a Plan Mexico, And of course, Plan Mexico speaks about generating 1.5 million jobs a year and ensuring that 50% of the domestic supply is made in Mexico and raising the ratio of investment to over 25% of GDP. And all of this sounds good. It sounds like a sensible plan. But the question is, how are you going to implement this plan if you're not creating the right incentives and the right context to create certainty in the country, and to create certainty mainly for investment to happen and for jobs to be created and for growth to be created and for prosperity to be adequately and sustainably distributed. And then my final point on this, and I can go over that in my next comment, would be this is what is stemming from within Mexico and from within the policy environment in the country, but then you have the shocks from the outside, mainly all of the tariffs stemming from the Trump 2 administration. And there is basically, I think Mexico has done the right choice of policies in relation to negotiating and have cold head, as the president has been calling this strategy of having formal diplomatic channels to negotiate with the different interlocutors. Of course, a very sort of strategic back channeling accompanying these negotiations. And the other comment that I will make is that we still, on those foreign challenges, we have to be very strategic, do a lot of negotiations with key actors, but we should also buckle up for a very bumpy ride until we have an anchor of USMCA 2.0, or you call it in any way you want. And the comment I would finally make is that I think that we are always going to be neighbors. We're always going to be partners. We just need to be smart partners. And the concept that I would use to sort of challenge the nearshoring concept that you were referring to, I would think about smart partnership.
Thank you very much, Vanessa, for those opening remarks. There's so much to unpack there, both the internal and the external challenges, and we'll come back to your suggestion of smart partnership in lieu of nearshoring. Eric, please, over to you for your 5 minutes of opening remarks. Thank you.
Ryan, thank you for inviting me here with such a distinguished panel, and it's really great to have the opportunity to join you and your team here at CSIS as a senior advisor. So this is something I'm looking forward to very much. So thank you for that opportunity, although I do have to bust your chops a little bit. You put me after Vanessa Rubio, which is an impossible place to go because she is so well-spoken and has such a great view of things. And I find myself simply nodding and saying, yeah, what she said is I agree with. Let me try to extend a couple of her points and make a couple other ones in the initial time allotted. The first thing, and I say this going back to my days at USTR as a very junior, to be sure, but a junior negotiator on NAFTA back in 1992. And the point then that we inculcated ourselves with is, I think, equally relevant today. and that is this: a strong, vibrant, economically healthy Mexico is good for the United States. Punto. Period. We need a strong, healthy Mexico that shares 1,800 miles of our southern border, that we rely on for supply chains and economic engagement, that we rely on in terms of management, sometimes better, sometimes worse, but management of the migration issue, management of the narcotics issue, management of the security issues. And by security, I'm not just talking about gangs and street warfare. I'm talking about also terrorism, where Mexico has been helpful in the past. And I'm also talking about, for example, working together on things like natural disasters, where after the hurricane that devastated New Orleans, Mexico sent military assets to help the United States in our time of need. Mexico's doing that now in terms of Canadian wildfires as well. But the point is that we are partners, and Vanessa's point about, we're neighbors, that's never going to change. I think that's absolutely relevant. And what it means is that we're going to have to find a way to make this work, because there is no alternative. Now, we can build walls, we can scream at each other, we can claim, we're not doing the right things, but at the end of the day, all that's doing is weakening each other. And when we weaken each other, what it means is we don't work as cooperatively together as we need to address common challenges. It also means that there are knock-on effects. So, for example, to the extent that the United States goes forward with 17 or some arbitrary percentage of new tariffs on tomatoes from Mexico. This is a huge industry in Mexico. It's very politically sensitive on both sides of the border. It also means that real jobs are at stake. And workers in Mexico who are producing tomatoes, if those jobs are taken away, one wonders what those workers are going to end up doing. I would suspect that at least a percentage of them will try to find their way to the United States. My point is that, jobs, people are resilient. They're going to go where they can best supply for their own needs, their family's needs, and they're going to go where jobs exist. And so if they're finding that employment is being challenged in Mexico, for example, you're going to add migratory pressures to the United States, and the cycle, repeats itself. My point is that these are issues that we know about, that we've dealt with in the past, and frankly, the tomatoes issue goes back years and years and years. It's not new, but we have to find a way to make it work. That's point number one. Point number two, the very provocative title of the panel discussion is "Nearshoring Dead?" Well, I suppose, as Vanessa says, we can call it all kinds of other things. But at the end of the day, international investors are looking at things from a relative perspective. It's not the absolute perspective of, is this economy the best in the universe? Is it the best it could ever be? They're looking at it in comparison to other relevant economies. And to the extent the economy of Mexico, for example, is perceived as better relatively to economies in Asia, well, then people are going to take a look at how to invest in Mexico. And it's not going to be because they want a friend shore, near shore, whatever shore. They want to make money, right? So there's that relative comparative analysis. To the extent that it's more effective, beneficial, productive to invest in Vietnam, Thailand, Cambodia, Philippines, wherever, they're going to do that. And so the point is, we in the United States can make it more difficult to invest in Mexico. And from my perspective, we should not, but to the extent we do, investors will take that, but what they want to see is two things. First of all, compared to what, number one, and number two, Vanessa hit on it again, really agree with what she said, the whole uncertainty, right? So if you have a certain tariff level, you might agree with it or disagree with it, but you can deal with it. You know what you're dealing with. If that level changes arbitrarily by the day, by the hour, by the year, whatever, it's impossible to make long-term investment decisions based on that. So that's point number two. And then point number three that I would throw into the mix here is very much, and we're going to talk about USMCA and all these things going forward, but whether or not USMCA continues to be the vehicle that people want it to be, and I personally think it will. I think, look, this is there. There's going to be a lot of rhetoric around it. There's going to be a lot of positioning. There's going to be a lot of negotiating. But at the end of the day, I personally believe it will continue forward in some basically similar circumstances, with some changes, of course. But I think that there are some important things that Mexico, in particular, all three countries, yes, but Mexico can do to continue to build its attractiveness to investment, no matter what the shape of USMCA looks like, because investors will use Mexico as an export platform to export to Europe, to export to Latin America, to export elsewhere, not just the United States, perhaps. And so things like monetary stability, which is really important, right? Macroeconomic stability, which is something that investors want. Judicial fairness. That was one of the entire reasons of NAFTA in the first place, before USMCA. Vanessa talked about that, right? But there is work to be done, I would suggest, on both sides of the border, but that's what investors look at, is rule of law and judicial transparency and fairness. Infrastructure, the ability to get goods from one place to another, not just roads, ports, bridges, although it's crucially important, but also in the digital space. And what are you creating in an environment to help business do better in the not just emerging, but the emerged digital environment that is truly a global space where business exists today. And then I think we also have to throw in there security, right? Personal security. It is an issue. And for investors, for business people, you don't want to send senior executives or frankly anybody into an insecure, unsafe situation. Or if your products are being raided on the roads, or bandits are, pilfering products or what have you. Yes, at some point, look, there's cost of doing business and, write-offs and things like this. But at some point, not only does it economically affect you, if it's starting to affect your people, your executives, your workers, that's just untenable. There's no business that wants to put their people in that sort of scenario and situation. I'm not suggesting that there's any paradise in the world where crime doesn't exist, but it is an issue, I'm sorry to say, in Mexico in a way that I think it can be and needs to be addressed. Having said that, again, I come back to the point, we got to understand that we're in this together. We can make it more easy for ourselves. We can make it more difficult for ourselves. That's the choice that faces us. I hope we choose the right way. Back to you, Ryan.
Great. Thank you so much, Eric. You've summed it up really nicely. The choices are pretty stark. And a lot to unpack there that I hope we can unpack in the subsequent 45 minutes. Before we do so, over to Diego for his opening remarks. You need to unmute, Diego.
Sorry, can you hear me now? Perfect. No, just thank you, Ryan, and the CSIS team. This is also my first CSIS event officially, so I'm really happy. Quick reaction to what Eric said. I agree completely. We're in together. Economically healthy Mexico is a strategic asset for the US. Our economies are deeply intertwined. There's no other relationship that impacts more lives in the US than its ties with Mexico, and vice versa. I want to talk a little bit about what Vanessa mentioned earlier. I agree. On paper, there's no other country in the world that was better positioned to take advantage of nearshoring than Mexico. We really had everything to be the most successful country in terms of value chain integration for at least 4 reasons. Number one, geopolitical trends. Number one, a decline in sourcing from China, mainly coming from the US. We had the pandemic, we had increasing US-China trade tensions, we had Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And if we add to that a bipartisan consensus in the US on China and the importance of decoupling from China, again, Mexico was the biggest winner. Number two, we have proximity. We have a unique geographical connection between the US and Mexico. We have the most dynamic border region in the world. Just last year, we had over 280 million crossings from Mexico into the US. That's just one half of the story. If we take the GDP from both sides of the border, we have the third largest economy in the world. Number three, again, trade. We have the biggest trade relationship in the world. Just last year, the US and Mexico exchanged over $900 billion in goods and services. Just to give you some perspective, if we trade approximately $1.75 million each minute, just the US and Mexico. For the duration of this panel, the US and Mexico would have traded over $100 million. For the second year in a row, Mexico is the US's top trading partner. And in 2024, we became the US's top supplier and also its top exporting destination. And lastly, we have low trade and investment barriers relative to the rest of the world, as Eric was saying. I think Mexico has plenty of competitive advantages relative to other countries in the hemisphere and in Southeast Asia. Mexico has 52 free trade agreements with 52 countries. But most importantly, we have USMCA, which the USMCA works for the majority of the trade between both countries. And at least for the last 5 years, Mexico has enjoyed privileged access to the US market. And I think this goes to Vanessa's point. The problem, however, is not that nearshoring is not taking place in the country. As Ryan was mentioning, industrial parks space, it's at capacity. I think currently only 2% of industrial space is vacant at the moment. Mexico is constructing more industrial parks every day. If we compare the number of industrial parks that we had in 2019 to the amount that we built in 2024, it was close to a 500% increase. But just like, I think the main point is not that we're not taking advantage of the phenomenon. I think it's that Mexico has been underperforming for the past 5 years. I think the AMLO administration wasted a unique opportunity to implement a comprehensive nearshoring strategy. In fact, some might argue that they worked against it. Examples: violating key USMCA provisions in energy, for example, not investing enough in energy generation. There's a limit to how much you can produce in the country if you don't have enough energy at reliable prices. Working against private sector investment in energy, again, neglecting structural issues such as Eric was saying, water scarcity, security, corruption. We have, just to sum up, we have strategic geography, we have a unique trade agreement, but where just the club work just ended. I think if there's a good analogy there to compare Mexico with Real Madrid. You have the best team, you have the best conditions, but you're finishing mid-table. Something happened in between that's not letting you fulfill your potential. And I think with this new administration, there are many opportunities to right some of those wrongs. But as Vanessa was saying, some of these challenges are structural, and they're not going to be addressed by the trade agreement or by just domestic policies. They need a more cooperation between both countries, and I'll leave it at that.
Terrific. Thanks so much, Diego, for those remarks. Again, a lot to unpack there. I want to start with Eric and talk specifically about kind of sectors where we will still need Mexico, and we still need to be smart and opt for that smart approach that you've laid out in the bifurcated decision that faces the United States. You and I both know, Eric, that modern supply chains are super complex. Even if President Trump's push for reindustrialization does meet with some success, we know that it's only going to be certain parts of certain industries, right? It's not going to be the entirety of the supply chain of certain industries. I'm going to you on this question, Eric, because you speak to the private sector all the time. You are a trade wonk. Which sectors would you say are the ones that are going to most rely on Mexico, where the U.S. might get some action with some of the policies of the administration, but we still need to be smart and have smart partnership, to use Vanessa's term, with Mexico? Which sectors would you highlight there?
Yeah, it's exactly right. I mean, look, supply chains have developed over time. They are increasingly complex. Everybody knows the story about the auto that goes across the border 7-8 times before a finished product is actually ready for the consumer. And you can't unwind those overnight. And the private sector is not going to unwind those overnight because they're waiting to see what's going to happen, right? So, I mean, you're not going to, let me put it this way. If you have $1.5 billion invested in Mexico in some project, whether it's autos or something else, you're going to be darn sure you know what you can predict going forward before you either unwind that operation or you retool or you look for other markets. What some companies are already starting to do, though, is to hedge their bets. They're starting to diversify. And so, yes, they might have put manufacturing production into Mexico, obviously to help capture the U.S. market. But with that capacity already installed and workers who are trained, you're not just going to, wrap that up. You may start looking to develop other export markets from that production platform. And that's what indeed we're seeing some auto companies do, and we're seeing some others do as well. Now, nobody will ever fully, from Mexico's perspective, nobody's ever going to fully replace the U.S. market, I would suggest. But you can hedge your bets, and you can start to build for a future where you may not be able to depend on the United States in exactly the same way. So I would put autos in the category that you're suggesting. I would put some of the manufactured products as well, the appliances that we all have in our kitchens and are running in our basements and various other places. That's very true. I think energy is clearly an aspect that we have to be open-minded about. Look, the United States supplies a lot of energy to Mexico, but vice versa. These energy markets are fully integrated, and the lights go out in El Paso if you're not careful. Or San Diego, or somewhere else. So these are issues that affect real people at the local level, and I think have to be very much looked at in that way. But I would also say something that doesn't occur to a lot of people, and that is high-end manufacturing products where you need sophisticated, talented, and educated engineers, for example. Mexico actually has a surplus of engineering talent that the United States somehow needs, and it's a very common thing in the aerospace industry and in other sectors to have much of your work done in Mexico that might be on the lower side of the supply chain end, because it may not be cost effective to do it in the United States with U.S. wage rates and regulations and things like this. But Mexico's talent is quite good, and so you work with the supply chain in Mexico. That, I think, is the dog that hasn't barked. I mean, there's a lot of high technology products that are fully integrated in the production platform. And then I think the final thing I would say, and Vanessa and Diego will have their examples as well. This isn't comprehensive, it's just a couple ideas. But the other thing that I'm increasingly focused on is the whole national security for the United States of semiconductors. If you look at where semiconductors are produced globally, it's an outrageously high percentage. It's like 75%, 80% are produced in 3 countries: Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. And if something goes wrong in the South China Sea, you can have a scenario whereby semiconductors at a massive scale are no longer available for global usage. And so therefore, a very intelligent approach, in my view, would be for countries in Latin America, which could include Mexico, should include Mexico, but others as well, work diligently to capture some of that supply chain. That's real reshoring. That is strategic, and it's something that, in my view, the United States would support, because the whole supply chain for semiconductors is not going to come soup to nuts back to the United States. You are going to need that production for various reasons done in other places, particularly the lower end aspect of the supply chain. So there are some ideas there. Again, the others will have their examples, but the only way to fully unwind the relationship is to take the United States into autarky. I don't know that we want to be North Korea. I just don't think that's what voters voted for. So we'll see.
Thanks, Eric. That's really useful for listeners as well to get a sense of the industries we're talking about when we talk about the need to have smart partnership and integrated supply chains, right? Otherwise, the idea might persist that the U.S. can simply reshore all of this, and it's simply a matter of policy. And what we lacked in the past was actually just the political will to do so, as opposed to the economics of it. So really, really useful to get that from you. Vanessa, I want to go to you. And you spoke in your opening remarks really eloquently about the domestic headwinds and the international headwinds. I want to ask you a question about the international headwinds, and then ask you to kind of put yourself in the shoes of a Mexican policymaker, which of course you've been for many years. What is your pitch as a Mexican policymaker to the Trump administration for this smart partnership? How would you go about constructing it? And then the second question is whether you think Mexico has more to gain by trying to convince the Trump administration that it needs to be an integrated North American market, a fortress North America, if you will, for their supply chain security initiatives, Or is your pitch rather to the private sector because you think it can be a more positive and effective pitch, hoping that the phenomena of smart partnership or nearshoring will happen or irrespective of what some of the state policy.
Thank you, Ryan. I think my pitch would be to the Trump administration. It would be to the business sector, and it would be also at the regional level. One thing we should also understand is that the bilateral relationship is not necessarily conducted only from DC and Mexico City. Mexico is between the first and the third trading partner for 34 of the 50 states of the United States. So we also need to integrate the regional perspective and the local perspective in this. As I was saying, this is complex, and complexity is about a series of actors, a number of actors, having exchanges, having connections, having negotiations, having businesses, all together at the same time. So I think the levels of negotiation and the levels of engagement and the pitches, therefore, should have to be very multi-level. It has to be the Trump administration, it has to be at the local level, and it has to be both public and private. And my pitch would be around the idea that there's nothing wrong with wanting to have more and better employment in your country. There's nothing wrong, and it's very understandable, to wanting to produce more in your country. Actually, let's do it together. The US should produce more and create better employment in the US, and Mexico should produce more and create better employment in Mexico. And that's domestic policy. What do you need to do in order for that to happen? How do you become more competitive? How do you become more attractive? How do you create more incentives for production to be made in your country? It doesn't have to be thought as a zero-sum game. You can do that, and at the same time, see a second layer of policies and a second layer of agreements in which you decide what are the supply chains, what is the bilateral trade that needs to happen in order for the region to be competitive, in order for the region to be what it's called to be, which is the most competitive region in the world. We trade already $1.65 million per minute. No? So if we don't understand that, and if we don't understand the big border, and if we don't understand this complexity, then we're not getting it. So again, the pitch has to be basically to every single actor in the US and Mexico. It has to be to understand that it's not a zero-sum game. It needs to be that you need to understand mainly three layers. What you do to attract more domestic investment, and then fine, it's good that we're creating more employments in our countries. Then what are we going to do together? And that's basically USMCA context, call it whatever you want to call it. Back then when we were negotiating NAFTA, we didn't know that it will end up in USMCA. Now we have USMCA. Let's not prejudge the name. There should be a sort of 3.0 free trade agreement. Maybe it's more a customs union, a sectoral customs union in which we decide that specific sectors, Eric was speaking about the semiconductors to be made in a very competitive way in North America. Maybe we can also do that. And for the same reason, security, but also for social aspects, health and pharma, no? What about pharma? What about the health industry? So there's a layer of domestic sort of reshoring. There's a layer of what we can do to be competitive and productive all together in the second layer, which is the regional level. And then what do we need from the world because we don't want to produce, or we are not productive, or we're not competitive to produce what is not produced in the region. And that is, I think, understanding that policy and that reality, honestly, is not black and white. There's no simple answers to complex challenges. We are facing very complex challenges. But now with all this, populism and polarization, we're tending to see things very, opposite ways and very black and white, as I was saying. So it's not a polarized world. We live in a very nuanced world. And usually we're asking me about putting myself in the shoes of the policymakers. The policymakers never make decisions between black and white. They make decisions in different shades of gray. And that's the I think the color that needs to be used to understand policy today, and to start to let the people know that we live a nuanced reality, and therefore you need nuanced policy making. And if we stop thinking about zero-sum game, then we can start understanding that it's fine that you're wanting to reshore some production to your country. It's only fair that you want to pay more to the people that are in the US or that are in Mexico or that are in Canada, no? And you want to be more competitive vis-a-vis the world, perfectly fine. Then, okay, what's the rest? What's the second layer that we want to produce together? And that is a different dialogue, and that is a different conversation. And then what are those elements that we need to import anyways? And this is the reality, I think, in policy making and in negotiations with the US. So my pitch would be sort of in those terms.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Vanessa. And I appreciate your note on nuance, and especially your addition of the fact that we in this webinar are talking about, of course, federal policy and what's coming out of Washington and what the Trump administration is talking about. But it's very important to remember, as you rightly said, there are individual state policies on trade, and even lower levels, frankly, counties, regions that are connected very tightly to the Mexican economy that are having their own policies to try to promote integration. Diego, I want to go to you. Vanessa says we should both produce more together. I like that. Talk to me about Plan Mexico from the Sheinbaum administration. This is particularly a plan that's aimed precisely at increasing domestic production in certain sectors. It's very, very detailed. Walk me through Plan Mexico a little bit, and do you think it meets the moment in terms of what it needs with the Trump administration if, as Vanessa says, we're both going to aim to produce more in our countries?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So yeah, Plan Mexico is both a reaction to the absence of a nearshoring strategy during the AMLO administration, and it's also a response from the Mexican government to the US in this grand strategy for decoupling from China. What in short, what Plan Mexico is looking is to offer tax incentives in order to increase production in Mexico. It's giving targeted sector incentives. I think that for the first time in 6 years, the Mexican government is prioritizing certain sectors over others. It is not the same thing as attracting investment in the automotive sector, in aerospace, and semiconductors, that just helping companies set up shop and, for example, build a facility that puts together furniture. Medical devices is a big. It's another one of the other sectors that has tailored incentives. The third component is that there's an emphasis on making things in Mexico, reducing Mexico's reliance on imports from outside of the country, particularly Asia. Another way of saying China. I think electronics it's a big component of that strategy, and it's also a big roadblock for Mexico. Mexico exports a lot to the U.S., but a significant part of those exports have Chinese electronics. So if Mexico is able to produce those electronics in the country, it's going to be much better in terms of USMCA compliance. And lastly, the plan also outlines investments in infrastructure, including electricity transmission by CFE. We have to be very clear about that. Plan Mexico gives priority to state-owned companies, in this case CFE, in order to increase electricity transmission, which is very different from what we had in 2013, 2014, where Mexico's electricity sector was open to private sector investment. In terms of limitations, again, I think it's a good plan with very lofty goals, as Vanessa was saying, but we have structural limitations that are outside of the Plan Mexico. Eric mentioned it. We have insufficient investment in infrastructure. We have regulatory uncertainty. Vanessa mentioned it as well. Recent constitutional reforms, including the ones that erased autonomous agencies and energy regulators, make it more difficult for investors to decide to invest in Mexico. They raise questions about legal predictability, insecurity in the region as well. You can set up a factory, but if once the truck leaves the facility and then tries to cross the border and there's cargo theft, that's a really big problem. External pressures, we talked about that as well. Capital goes where the returns are higher, but also where their investments are safer. And tariffs are really putting a lot of pressure into Mexico's investment sector. And I think the main limitation for Plan Mexico is financial. It is a very ambitious plan, but I don't think it's backed up financially, at least not by the government. I think the priorities for the financial priorities for this government are on other projects. Like, for example, Pemex is one of the main receptors of public resources. Monetary transfers are also very important. So I think if we really wanted this program to be successful, you need to increase its financial backing, and you need to work together with the private sector in order to make it work. And that's where the energy component, I think it's really important. And I mentioned it at the beginning. The only way that Mexico can increase its production and nearshore more production into the country is by having enough energy. And right now we're at capacity. I think it's going to take less than a year or 2 years when demand it's bigger than supply. And I think 60% of all the electricity used in Mexico is for industrial use. And without investment in electricity, nearshoring is simply going to stagnate. And I mean, again, that goes beyond what the program can do.
Thanks, Diego. Eric, I want to go to something that you said in your opening remarks. You said it's all relative, right? Mexico is competing with other countries at a similar level of development, with a similar level of labor costs, technological development, et cetera, and you named a few things that I wrote down here as deficiencies that make, to use Diego's metaphor, Real Madrid end up in the middle of the table, even though they have quite significant talent, and we should expect them to be at the top of the table. You mentioned judicial fairness, infrastructure deficits, obviously the crisis of cargo theft. I think in the Andrés Manuel López Obrador administration, there were more cargo thefts in the sexenio under his leadership than in any other. Something like 85,000 overall. Rail theft is a big issue as well. Macroeconomic stability and the energy component that Diego just mentioned. When you look at those deficiencies and those reasons why Real Madrid, to stick with this metaphor, is performing in the middle of the table, who is performing at the top of the table? Just so we get a sense of if nearshoring is still a thing or supply chain relocation is still going to happen, who is Mexico competing with, right? Who's in their division and who's out competing them at the moment?
Yeah, I don't know if I can stay with that analogy. I suppose I could talk about Barca or Atletico, but before I do,
rather a test of your trade knowledge, Eric, not a test of your sports knowledge.
Exactly right. Is just to really reemphasize what Diego was saying on the energy side. I think that's absolutely right. And that's one of the inputs that every manufacturer has to deal with, is not just the supply, but the cost of energy. And that's something that it goes to your point, Ryan, about what makes an economy efficient or no. And then I should have mentioned healthcare and medical devices in terms of sectors previously, and I'm glad both Vanessa and Diego picked up on that. And I would concur that that's definitely a sector as well. Companies are not stupid. They recognize that Vietnam and China are farther away from the United States than Mexico. They get that. They see a map. They know that there are added transportation costs. They know that there are added delays and that sort of thing. So there has to be something else that makes an economy like China, which I would argue is Mexico's main competitor for the United States market, more attractive, or at least traditionally more attractive, seen to be more attractive, let's put it that way, for some manufacturers than Mexico. And so when you unpack that, a lot of it has to do with the cost of labor. A lot of it has to do with regulatory issues, infrastructure, that sort of thing. But what we're seeing right now is that the costs of production, and I'm not just talking the direct monetary costs, although those are going up because the cost of labor in China is going up, but the costs, the political costs of doing business in China are being raised dramatically, as are the costs in terms of trade costs with tariffs and that sort of thing. So that's a perfect example, I think, of a relative adjustment. Mexico hadn't done anything, and they've become more competitive vis-a-vis China. just because of the U.S. bilateral relationship with China, and also China's own economy and how things are developing there. I think that a lot of people moved out of China over the last years for a variety of reasons, not the least of which, again, is rising labor costs, but they didn't go to Mexico. Diego was talking about AMLO had a perfect example to make Mexico the most competitive reshoring location in the world, and I totally agree with that. But companies didn't go to Mexico necessarily; they went to Vietnam, right? And again, you had that distance was not changed. I mean, companies get it. Vietnam's a lot further away than Mexico. Well, why would they go there instead of Mexico? Well, again, the cost of production, certainty, infrastructure, security, all those sorts of things. So there are things that Mexico has to address to bring it in line with the most competitive economies in the world. But the thing that has been a real advantage and will continue always to be an advantage is the geographic proximity to the world's largest economy. You also have almost the entire business class in Mexico educated, at least if not in the United States, with U.S. business practices and international business practices. You have family ties. You have cross-border investment in infrastructure. We know each other really well. And those ties will always be an advantage. So my contention would be, if the Sheinbaum administration would be able to address some of these, you don't have to turn it into a perfect country. No country is perfect. The U.S. certainly isn't perfect. But if you can begin to address some of those issues and reduce the cost of them, reduce the cost of pilferage of products, increase the certainty of power generation and water, decrease the political risk of the judicial process. These are issues that are directly relevant to investors, and if you can begin to do that, then all of a sudden a country like Mexico becomes even more attractive vis-a-vis the main competitors, which would be at this stage anyway, East Asia. So I think those are some of the things to think about. Do I have the magic bullet to make that happen? No. I mean, it's political will and it's money, and I think Mexico has both. But the question is, do they want to deploy them in that way? And that's a domestic question for Mexicans.
Great, thank you, Eric. And it's a very good reminder that if it's all relative, look, we don't have to turn ourselves into paradises, but we do have to be, relatively speaking.
Yeah, that's right.
A great point. So in the time that remains, I want to talk about the USMCA, of course. It's come up numerous times in our conversation, as we all know, and as CSIS has done a lot of work on. There is a revisiting of the agreement that is supposed to happen in 2026. We may move that process up. But it's either going to look like a revisiting or more of a renegotiating if we move some things around. I think Vanessa referred to it as North America 3.0. So maybe we'll start with you, Vanessa. Eric says he feels very secure that USMCA is going to continue being the foundation of our economic relationship and will continue to serve as the foundation of a competitive overall economic bloc. Do you feel the same way, despite all the uncertainty at the moment about USMCA, and maybe a couple reflections from you, Vanessa, on how we can make it better throughout the process?
Yes, Ryan, I think definitely we will have some form of agreement. Again, the name is secondary, but we still today, with all the different tariffs that have been applied to Mexico, between 75 and 82% of our trade goes under the rules of free trade between the US and Mexico. So still that is the anchor, and that is the majority of our trade, no? And in many of the tariffs imposed by this Trump administration, the exception has been for USMCA, not only for the US produced goods. So I think definitely is in the interest of the three countries in this case to preserve an agreement, to preserve an anchor of certainty. In the case of Mexico, more than 35% of our GDP is explained in relation to trade with the US. So this is important. We're the first trading partner of the US. We're the first source of its imports. And of course, we are still the 13th largest economy in the world. Sometimes we think about Mexico, a developing country, vis-a-vis the US. That's true. But Mexico is the 7th largest manufacturing powerhouse in the world, no? So all of these should give us elements in order to reconduce, hopefully, some of the policies we need to address in a more effective way to become more competitive for this relative perspective that Eric was referring to in relation to the investment decisions, no? Because, of course, investors look for the analysis of risks, return, security, and diversification. And there, Mexico has to be in the equation. We are a G20 country. We're an OECD country. So I'll go back to the beginning where I started. We need to do our homework. The best de-risking strategy and the best competitiveness strategy is for Mexico to do its homework. And that's the thing we can control. We can improve and we should improve our security, our energy, our water, our labor offer, our infrastructure, and the rule of law. I mean, it sounds very simple. Of course, this is very complex. And as Diego was saying, this requires a lot of policy will, also significant resources to back up Mexico plan, but also to back up the development poles plan and the mixed investment regime that the current government is proposing, for instance, to think about Pemex or to think about CFE. But still, we need to give the tools for investors to, decide for Mexico in these relative terms when Mexico is competing with Malaysia, with Thailand, with Vietnam, with India, with Brazil. So we should be able to do it better in relation to policy. We should be able to do it in relation to economic growth. Economic growth is beginning to be a huge constraint for Mexico because employment is not behaving the way it had been behaving. Also investment. And I think the current Mexican administration has a huge opportunity to present a sound economic package, as we call it. It will be presented for 2026 in the first days of September. And that will give us the macro fundamentals and the economic policy that the current government is willing to pursue in the coming year at least, and give us some sense of where these investments in security, energy, water, infrastructure, labor are going to go. But we need to have wise investment, sound policies, and of course we need to give anchors to economic growth. Otherwise, Mexico is not going to be in this position that we should be at. And I coincide there with Diego and Eric. We should be doing better if we would only be doing our homework better. But there's always an opportunity to handle both better policy making at the domestic front to provide for the incentives for growth and for prosperity to happen in Mexico, and also to have a very strategic, sophisticated, nuanced negotiation strategy with the US and Canada. And I'm going to say also that we think that it's a given that there's going to be trilateral negotiations. We need to make those negotiations to be trilateral, because for the time being, they have been very bilateral. Bilateral with the US in the case of Mexico, bilateral with the US in the case of Canada. And let us remember that USMCA in its conception was a trilateral treaty, as so was NAFTA. There was previous agreement between the US and Canada, but I think it's in the best interest of the three countries to maintain this trilateral anchor for certainty, competitiveness, and increasing productivity in the region.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. I like your metaphor of doing homework. Smart partners do their homework, to put both of your metaphors together. There's one question that's come in the Q&A box, and I want to pose it to Diego. It's a quick question for you, Diego. It's about the 25% tariff that's currently on autos and auto parts, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, minus, of course, the U.S. content. Mm-hmm. The question is about whether you think the policy will endure throughout Trump's term because of the UAWs, the United Auto Workers, political salience, or if this tariff will disappear as part of the revisiting of the USMCA.
Mm-hmm. I think it's important to understand that there's two levels of negotiations going on between the U.S. and Mexico. On the first level, we have the negotiations to basically get rid of the 232s and tariffs. That is the auto tariffs, the steel and aluminum tariffs, the copper tariff, and then we have the conversation about the review process. I think if we talk about the steel and aluminum tariffs, I think the auto tariffs, 25%, I don't think that's sustainable, not even in the long term, in the medium term, in terms of the competitiveness of the auto industry. I think it's been pretty clear from our conversation today that the auto sector is our most integrated sector, and there's really no way for the US to compete with China and with other Asian countries if it's not when partnering with Mexico and Canada. So I think it's definitely not going to be 25%. I don't think we're ever going to go back to the 0% that we had before, or the 2.5% most favored nation tariff that we had for non-compliant auto trade. I think we were likely going to be somewhere in between. I think 12% might be something that the Mexican auto sector could work with. Again, not ideal. It's going to increase prices. It's going to make us less competitive vis-a-vis China. But I think that's where we're going to get to. I mean, in an interesting symbol, for example, the 75% that we have for North American, in order to get preferential tariff treatment under USMCA for autos, it was a compromise between the original ask of 85% from the first Trump administration and the original 62.5%. So I think both Mexico and Canada realize that we're not going to go back to a tariff-free scenario, but it's definitely not going to be 25% because, again, it's too costly. And even, auto workers in the US are going to feel the consequences of maintaining that policy.
Terrific. Thank you, Diego. I noticed that we're at 4 p.m. We need to bring this webinar to a close. I just want to bring Eric in for the last word. 30 seconds, Eric, nothing more, just a set of closing reflections. And also, if you have something to suggest, Vanessa has mentioned smart partnership throughout all of this. We talked about it as complementarity in an analytical piece we put out a few weeks ago. Any ideas about what we're observing in supply chain security, what we might call it, if not nearshoring? A couple seconds of closing reflection.
Well, I like Vanessa's smart, use the word smart somehow, and people are immediately attracted to it. But look, the private sector is going to react. And it's up to governments to figure out the incentives on, to create the North America that we want to see. The private sector will react to that. And if the incentives are appropriate, tariff rates and regulatory and rule of law and infrastructure and all those things, they will make North America continue to be the most competitive region in the world. If governments decide that we want to, play politics and try to impoverish each other and not see this as a zero-sum game, as Vanessa was indicating, that is clearly not, it shouldn't be the case, and I agree, then we're going to have problems. And the private sector will react, and what they're going to do is they're going to start investing elsewhere or suboptimally in ways that will ultimately create disadvantages for the region by reducing growth and reducing the well-being of all of our citizens. So that's what's at stake. It's a big deal. And my fervent hope is that all three governments understand that and work together to try to build North America to the most prosperous and best place to live in the entire world.
What a terrific place to end. Thanks so much, Eric, Vanessa, Diego Marroquin Vitar. Thanks so much for joining us. Vanessa Rubio Marquez, Professor in Practice and the Associate Dean for Extended Education at the LSE School of Public Policy. Eric Farnsworth, one of our brand new Senior Associates with the Americas Program at CSIS, and Diego Marroquin Vitar, Adjunct Fellow with our program as well. Fascinating discussion. Thank you all very much for your analysis.